I don't even know what to say this morning. It's been a week, right? I mean, for our world. I have so many feelings, and I'm sure you do too. There are a few moments when I, as your minister, am not clear about how to respond, but this conflict in Israel and Palestine is one of them. I picked that reading that we just heard last week before we were faced with the horrors of this week. As yet again we bear witness from an ocean away to a violence that cuts for some like it was right here at home. To violence that emboldens people right here at home. Feels like some of this language isn't about ancestors, doesn't it? Even though this conflict is in some ways completely about ancestors. Now, I'm no scholar of international affairs or the Middle East or this conflict in particular, but let's not forget the ancestors who got us in this place in the first place, who might not only be the ancestors of the Israelis and Palestinians, but perhaps of all of us, leaving people fighting for holy land, for statehood, for security, to live in a land where their children can survive, where their children can thrive. This sermon, was supposed to be about the ways in which who we are, our queer, feminist, anti-racist selves, how we are the nightmares of those who came before us. Like Reverend Michael Wigglesworth, our second minister, who pushed down and denied his own queerness because of a fear of not pleasing a vengeful God. How might he respond to his eventual successor being a queer, transgender man who doesn't believe in hell? That would be a nightmare to him. But it's hard to be genuine about that right now because it feels so trite when there's a literal nightmare going on in our world. And don't get me wrong, the nightmare we've become to our ancestors is a beautiful thing. We've expanded who's inside this circle of love. We've embraced the ways that difference makes us stronger through our 375-year history. Our ancestors had to, one way or another, continually open their hearts to change and become what might be a nightmare to their ancestors. And when I think about this, I weirdly hope that those who come after become things that are so impossible for us to understand that they might feel like nightmares to us. I weirdly hope that I get criticized for not seeing what is obviously clear in hindsight, because that means we're moving in a direction that quite possibly is towards more love and understanding than is even possible for us to imagine right now. I can't help but thinking about a minister of ours, a previous one, who was so active politically in the cause of temperance, ending legal use of alcohol, instead of, say, universal suffrage of women and people of color. Like, really? That's what you cared about? This world might very well be his worst nightmare. And in 25 years, when this congregation celebrates its 400th anniversary, perhaps this very sermon will be criticized for my hand-wringing, for not taking a strong enough stance on what's happening. How could that transgender guy of all people not get it? Whatever it is. I don't just mean about the war, but whatever other issue I or we are completely oblivious to. Of course, that believing this sermon will be important enough to read or watch by our descendants is very questionable. I do believe, however, that we'll still be around. Side note, I did the math on this morning because I was curious. I'll be 63, which means with the current predicted retirement age, I will probably still be working. So I hope I'll still be a minister because I love this job, which means I could still be your minister, which honestly wouldn't be healthy, but wouldn't that be wild, especially if I became my own worst nightmare, right? The truth, and the truth and hope is actually that a lot more of you might still be here. And I mean, think about what you believed 25 years ago, if you are that old. 25 years ago, when I was 13, I thought racism was over. I didn't understand that transgender people existed. I thought it was unfair that a friend of mine who was Inuit, I grew up in Canada, had a special card that gave her taxes off at restaurants. And perhaps most relevant for today, I thought it was ridiculous to get emotional over things that were happening on the other side of the world, or even on the other side of town from where I was. Really? I thought, it doesn't involve me. Why would you get emotional about that? Why should I even care? Of course, I was 13. I didn't think about how something like this might feel to Jews or Muslims. I didn't think about how violence abroad could impact people in my community. I didn't think about what it might mean for two oppressed people to be in this kind of conflict. And of course, I didn't have children. If there's one thing that's impacted for me how I feel about these things, it's having children. What happened and continues to happen to children in this conflict makes me wonder what I would do if they were my children. There is a song we sometimes sing here by Elizabeth Alexander. It's called No Other People's Children. There are no other people's children. That's how I felt this week. So I want to acknowledge that you are probably feeling a lot of things. Grief, and we'll talk more about grief next week. Fear, anger, rage, and all of those feelings are valid. And I also want to acknowledge that there are circles for whom this is impacting folks more than others. At the center are the people who have ties to Israel and Gaza, people who are Jewish, people who are Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and then the rest of us. I, for example, am a white, culturally Christian, the minister of what I would call a Christian passing church, because let's be real, a lot of people don't know the difference between this church and a Christian one. And I don't have personal grief or fear about this. And it makes me think of something called the ring theory. If you can put that up on our screen, Maddie. Which is it's going to be very colorful, but I'll try to describe it. It's a theory that's often used for personal crises. But I think it's really relevant for us in moments like this, where crisis is often tied up with identity. This was developed by clinical psychologist Susan Silk. She advises that those surrounding a person in crisis to direct expression of their own feelings of stress towards those less close to that person, and direct only support towards those that are closer to that person. So the concept is comfort in, dump out, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Here's how I believe this applies to this situation. At the center of this circle are those who are directly impacted, the citizens of Israel and Gaza, who are not responsible for the actions of the Israeli government or Hamas. Those who know these people, Jewish and Muslim or Arab people here in the United States and abroad, and then the rest of us. Which I guess is my way of saying that this event impacts all of us. Of course it does, we live on Earth. But those in the center, they need our comfort right now. So dump in, comfort out. You might not even be aware of who needs comfort right now, but I think we should just be thinking about this. All right, so can you take that down, Maddie? Thank you so much. All right, back to our own ancestors. If you'll allow me a moment to go back to our theme. I want to look at some skeletons in our own closet, perhaps especially when it comes to this moment in time. Let's think about where we, our ancestors, have been those ancestors. The one Adrienne Marie Brown talks about being afraid to bring in, afraid to be accountable to. One of the most devastating forces in our world is this idea of eradicating an ethnic group through genocide or through eugenics. And guess who was really into eugenics? Early historic Unitarians, some of our own ancestors. They saw it as scientific salvation and evolutionary optimism. This wasn't some fringe opinion. The American Unitarian Association, a precursor to our own Unitarian Universalist Association, published a book with the title, The Blood of a Nation, a study of the decay of races through the survival of the unfit, by David Starr Jordan in 1901. Yes, this was literally the title. He was a sought-after speaking in Unitarian and Universalist events, and published another 18 books through the American Unitarian Association. It's very uncomfortable. Part of the idea was that they would sterilize the unfit so that they could not pass along their bad genes. And who might be considered unfit, you ask? Well, David Starr Jones himself said, Weak people bring failure upon themselves and ultimately will bring failure on the nations they live in if they are the ones who survive and reproduce. And who was considered unfit? The poor, those who grew up in foster care, and well, maybe those people who were likely to be part of a particular racial class. In 1927, a court case came forward to sterilize a specific woman named Carrie Buck because she had been raised in foster care, had been raped and impregnated, and was considered part of the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class. She was legally allowed to be sterilized by the Supreme Court in a decision written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who, along with Chief Justice William Howard Taft, were part of the leadership of the National Unitarian Conference at the time. I can see some of your faces like, what? This is like a really shocking part of our history and really terrible, and it's important for us to acknowledge that. Eugenics was used at the time to justify sterilizing people, and Unitarians supported this, and so did some Universalists, which is the history of this church. It is horrific. And who were the people looking towards eugenics thinking it was a good idea? The Nazis. Isabel Wilkinson describes in her book, Caste, how the Nazis in Germany looked to the United States treatment of black folks in Jim Crow as a model for their treatment of Jews. During the First World War, the German Society of Racial Hygiene congratulated the United States, applauding their dedication with which Americans sponsor research in the field of racial hygiene, with which they translate theoretical knowledge into practice. I think it's important that we consider the actions of these ancestors. And while I've said I'm no scholar on world history or the Middle East, in many ways, it was the genocide that took place during World War II that led to this founding of Israel in 1948 and kicked off this ongoing conflict. So I wonder, how can we strive to be the wildest nightmares of these people, of these eugenicists that came before us? It seems like a worthy goal. So friends, this is a lot of heavy stuff, right? It's a lot of history that's uncomfortable. The world's uncomfortable right now. So I just want to express my love to you. I see day in and day out from each of you through personal interactions and public, people who are trying to live out your best, compassionate, honest lives in line with your values. You inspire me and you hold me accountable and help me learn and grow alongside you. In moments like this, I know that this can be a space that holds complexity, that responds with love, that recognizes that we have changed, that we can change, and that we will change. So let us become our ancestors' wildest nightmares. Let us open up that circle of love. May it be so, and let us say together, Amen. Amen.